Chapter 8, disclosures. In the book, it's mandated disclosures. It's on page 163. First, we're going to talk about property owner's role regarding the property condition. The seller needs to provide to the buyer a written property condition disclosure, and the seller must identify all material facts relating to the property and its surrounding area. Your role as an agent, you are not responsible to identify latent defects. If you are aware of a latent defect, you must disclose it. Let's talk a little bit about latent defects. Latent defects are unseen defects. On the exam, you might get asked, what's the most common latent lead defect on a property? If you get that question, your answer is going to be lead pipes. Okay, so a latent defect is something you cannot see. It would be, here's a question that you might get. If you get a question about a property inspector going down to the basement, first you're going to think he's looking for radon because he's going down to the basement. And then the story is going to go on that he's looking around the sinks and the faucets and the washer and the dryers. Then you're going to think wet areas, and you're going to think maybe they're talking about mold. And then they're going to say the inspector cut out a piece of drywall. And then they're going to ask you what he is it's going to say, what is the inspector looking for? Your answer is going to be latent defects, because the fact that he cut out that drywall, it was obviously he was looking for something that he could not see. Okay, he could not see. Just to tell you a little story about my most incredible latent defect. Years ago, I had a client that was looking for a property where it had like a home in the front and then some apartments in the back. And the home was on a slab. It was built on a slab, so it was built on, cement. And the buyer kept telling me, I really want to buy, it was called a statewide building. I really want to buy one of those, but I don't want carpet. He was just, for some reason, deathly afraid of carpet. So I eventually found one that was in a pretty good neighborhood, and it was a really nice building. But when you walk in, the first thing you notice is that it had brand new carpet on it. And so I told him before I went over there, I said, well, I think I have the right building for you. And it does have carpet, but the good news is it's brand new carpeting. So what you can do is you can, after you buy it, we could wait a year or whatever and then put in your tile. At least it's new, and then you can save money and do whatever you want at that point, wait a year. So he ended up buying it, and he was pretty happy with that. He liked the building. About a year later, he called me up and he said, come on over here right now. And you could tell he was really mad. And I was like, okay. So I pulled up in front of his property, and I noticed that there was all the carpet was all torn. It was in a big pile outside of his front door. And I was thinking, oh, geez, he found a crack in his foundation or something that was under the carpet. Like maybe it's shifting, maybe it's, doing something, warping or whatever the cement was doing. So I was like trying to prepare myself to answer something like that. When I walked in, he goes, come here. And I was like, okay. And he points down to where the carpet was removed, and there was a homicide scene painted on the cement under the carpet. He was very superstitious. But, okay, that was an unseen defect. It was in an area in California where no one's talking to anybody. So I didn't know there was a homicide on the property. I would have told him, even though it's truly not a material fact that affects the condition of the property. But if he asked me if there was a homicide, I would have answered honestly if I knew of one. But when he pulled that carpet up, there was a big homicide scene. That was my most latent defect, or the one that disturbed my business for a while. Okay. The seller must identify all material facts relating to the property and surrounding area. They must identify any known latent defects. It's not the agent's job to go and find latent defects. It's not your job to cut out the drywall, or in my case, to lift up the carpet and pull it out of the wall and lift it up to see if there's a homicide scene under there. But if you do know about it, you have to disclose it. The agent is not responsible to identify a latent defect. Again, if you know about it, you do have to disclose it. And obviously, you need to disclose what is readily seen. There may come a time where you're going to meet a seller who looks at his property and thinks that it's a perfect property, and you as an agent are going to know things like there might be termite damage because it looks like there's a hole there in the windowsill, or it might have some dry rot over here, or you might notice maybe the foundation slipping a little bit. If the seller doesn't know about it and does not want to disclose it, you as the agent must still disclose it. You might want to talk to your broker how you deal with that. In my office, what we would do is we would just fill out a different form. Say this is the agent disclosure, and on this date, I saw this or I saw that. Home warranties will include defects of major mechanical, plumbing, and electrical, heating, and appliance items. Okay, they're just a really good selling point. It just makes the property more attractive to buyers. And they do work. I did take advantage of them. I got a heating system fixed one time. It's pretty good. New home construction warranty. Some states have mandatory statutes with warranties that are offered by new home builders, and they usually just cover limited defects. Always, always, always try to get an inspector in there. Don't claim liability for anything. We have a liability ball in my brokerage, and whenever there's something, if somebody says to you, is my foundation sinking, what you're going to say to them is go hire a professional or check it. Or do you think I have termite infestation? I don't know, let's hire a professional to check for your termite. Take that liability ball and throw it at an inspector. Okay, don't ever close a deal with that liability ball in your hand. I mean, I want to keep you out of trouble. Okay, an inspection by a professional is not a warranty, but try to always get them, because you don't want that liability in your hand when the deal closes. Red flag issues. It's a defect which requires further investigation. So a red flag would be something like if you're walking in a house and you see a brown spot in the ceiling. It's like, gee, I wonder what's causing that brown spot. It's something that makes you want to investigate further. Okay, or maybe a crack on a driveway with the property that's on a hill and it's a big crack. Maybe I'd like to get somebody out here to investigate, make sure that this hill isn't slipping. Okay, so those are your red flag issues. So here's a brown spot on the ceiling. Ooh, the smell of mold. Absolutely. If you walked into a house and it looked really clean, but you still smelled mold, wouldn't you want to find out why? Ministerial relationship is when an agent helps a non-client with something related to the transaction. So here's an example. It's help them get paperwork together, give a phone number to several inspectors. Just give them information. They're not your buyer, they're not your seller, but you are representing the other person in the transaction. They ask you, can you help me get the paperwork together? Even though you're not representing them, you sit down with them and you help them out and give them some phone numbers or whatever. Here's your non-material facts. It's a felony, death, suicide, homicide, the fact that someone with HIV or AIDS has lived on the property. Okay, none of these, when you think of these as non-material facts, not one of these affects the condition of the property. Your material facts are the things that affect the property. Like a meth lab, that would affect the property. That gas and that smoke is going to get into the drywall. If you're on a slipping hill, slipping foundation, that's going to affect the property. Or if the foundation isn't secure, that affects the property. But a felony on the property, you don't have to disclose that. It's a non-material fact. Death, suicide, homicide, HIV, AIDS, all non-material facts. But if you are asked, you have to disclose it. Be careful in some states here with the HIV and AIDS. In some states, even if asked, you're not allowed to disclose it. So check the laws when you start jumping states, because every state's different. To identify the lot or improvement side, encroachment easements, hire a professional. One of your questions is, what's the best way to find an encroachment? Hire a surveyor. Okay. How big is my property? I don't know. Let's hire a professional to come out and measure it. Okay, there is a story in this book that talks about how a couple of brokers did a transaction on some land, and it was sold. They represented the buyer, and they bought it as 7 acres. And then a few years later, they represented the seller, who was now selling it, who was the original buyer, and they were selling it for 7 acres. And then they represented on that transaction both sides of the transaction. And then the buyer, before the buyer closed on the property, or actually, yeah, before he closed on the property, he had a surveyor come out and look at the size of the property and measure it out. It was never 7 acres, it was 3 acres. Okay, so get everything measured. Keep out of trouble. Get that liability ball out of your hands. Hire a professional. Disclose anything that adversely affects the property. Okay, those are going to be your material facts. You have to disclose things like special assessments. Maybe remember, a special assessment is a tax that's added to your property for a improvement that you're going to benefit from. So, for instance, if the city puts a sidewalk down one road, only the people on that road are going to pay for that special assessment. If the city decides to put a new elementary school in a school district, only that school district's going to get that special assessment. Okay, stigmatized, psychologically impacted properties. I would disclose those. I would disclose if there was some type of murder-suicide, even though they are not considered material facts. I would tell the truth, because eventually the neighbors are going to tell them anyways, so just get it over with. And you need to disclose that they have the right, the buyer has the right to have access to a Megan's Law database, which is going to give a list of sexual predators that are all across the United States. And that's in Section 8.